The letter arrived on a Tuesday, creased and coffee-stained, and written in a hand so furious it had nearly torn through the paper in 3 places, and Nathan Finley read it twice on the porch of his failing cattle ranch in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882, and when he was done, he set it down on his knee and looked out at the red hills and laughed for the first time in 6 months. His brother Clement had written from Abilene, Kansas, where he was working as a telegraph operator and apparently collecting gossip the way other men collected debts. The letter was long and rambling, the way Clement's letters always were, full of news about cattle prices and railroad disputes and the weather, but buried in the 3rd page was the passage that stopped Nathan cold. Clement had written, "There is a woman in this town, Nathan, and I am telling you about her only because I think you should know what passes for a human being out here in Kansas. Her name is Delia Doyle, and she is the daughter of old Patrick Doyle, who ran the feed store on Elm Street before he died last winter. I have now heard her described in 4 separate letters from 4 separate men who tried to court her, and every single one of them said the same thing. Too much. Too much fire, too much opinion, too much refusal to be quiet when a man is speaking, too much everything. Marcus Webb said she argued with him about land rights for 45 minutes and made him feel like a fool. Thomas Hale said she threw a boot at him when he suggested she ought to sell her father's store. Charlie Dunmore wouldn't even put the details to paper, but said she was simply too much for any man of sound mind to take on. I am telling you this, brother, because I figure you ought to know the kind of woman this town is producing, and also because she is apparently determined to keep the store running herself and is driving the Merchants Association entirely mad with her ideas. She is 24 years old and apparently unstoppable. God help whoever ends up tangled with her." Nathan read it again, slower the 2nd time. He read the words "too much for any man" and felt something shift in his chest like a lock turning over after years of rust. He set the letter down, looked at the dying grass on his south pasture, thought about his empty house, his empty supper table, the 4 walls that had nothing on them because he had never seen the point of decoration when there was no one to decorate for. He thought about the last 3 years of solitary work and the particular silence that came at night when the wind died down and the cattle were still, and there was nothing in the world but the sound of his own breathing. Then he picked up a pen, found a piece of paper in the desk drawer, and wrote back to Clement. He wrote, "Tell me everything about Delia Doyle, and tell me where I can write to her directly." Clement's response arrived 2 weeks later and contained, somewhat predictably, a great deal of alarm. "Nathan, I was not suggesting you pursue this woman. I was warning you about her. She is not the kind of woman a man courts. She is the kind of woman a man survives if he is lucky. She has opinions about the cattle trade, the railroad negotiations, the territorial government, the price of flour, and the proper way to shoe a horse, and she will share all of them whether you ask or not. She ran 3 suitors out of town by sheer force of personality. I am telling you this as your brother who loves you and does not want to see you destroyed. She is 24, she is tall, she has dark red hair, and she looks at a man like she is weighing whether he is worth the words she is about to use on him. She is not too much for any man, Nathan. She is too much for most men. There is a difference, I suppose, but I am not sure which category you fall into, and I do not wish to find out." Nathan folded that letter too and put both of them in the desk drawer. Then he sat down at the table with a clean sheet of paper, and he wrote a letter to Delia Doyle, in care of Doyle's Feed and Grain on Elm Street, Abilene, Kansas. He wrote it carefully, which was not his habit. He was a man who had spent most of his 30 years on horseback or in the dirt, not writing letters, and his handwriting showed it. But he wrote it slowly and he thought about every word. He wrote, "Miss Doyle, my name is Nathan Finley. I ranch cattle outside of Cimarron in the New Mexico Territory. My brother Clement works as a telegraph operator in Abilene, and he has mentioned you in 2 letters now, and I will be honest with you because I suspect you prefer honesty to performance. He mentioned you as a warning. He wrote that you had been described in every letter he had received from men who courted you as too much. Too much fire, too much opinion, too much refusal to be something smaller than you are. I read that and I thought, finally, someone worth the ride. I am not writing to court you in any formal sense, because I don't believe in formality with strangers, and I imagine you don't either. I am writing because I think a person who has been called too much by 4 different men is probably exactly enough, and I would like to know if that person would be willing to correspond with a man who has been told too many times that he is too stubborn, too direct, and too unlikely to do things the way they are supposed to be done. I have a ranch that is in better shape than it looks from the road, a horse named Cooper who is smarter than most people I have met, and nothing in particular to offer you except honesty and the genuine belief that a woman with opinions about cattle pricing is more interesting than one without. Write back if you are inclined. Don't if you aren't. Either way, I hope your store is doing well. He signed it Nathan Finley and mailed it on a Friday morning, and then he went back to work and tried not to think about it. He thought about it constantly. He thought about it while he was mending fence on the east side of the property, while he was checking the watering troughs, while he was lying awake in the dark listening to the coyotes call to each other across the hills. He replayed his own letter in his head and found a dozen things he might have said better, a dozen ways it might have sounded like the ramblings of a man who had spent too long alone talking to a horse. 3 weeks passed. He began to think she had read it and filed it under the category of men not worth responding to, which was, he admitted to himself, a perfectly reasonable assessment. Then the reply came. He recognized immediately that it was not the handwriting of a woman who had spent time on careful composition. It was fast and sure, and covered the page without apology, the words tilting slightly upward at the ends of lines the way writing did when a person's thoughts were moving faster than their hand. She wrote, "Mr. Finley, I was going to ignore your letter because I ignore most of them. I receive a fair number of letters from men who have heard about me, and they generally fall into 2 categories. The first is men who want to save me from myself, which is exhausting. The second is men who find the idea of a difficult woman entertaining until they actually meet one, which is worse. Your letter is neither of those things, and that is why I am responding, though I reserve the right to stop at any time if you become tiresome. I want to address your observation directly. The men who called me too much were not wrong in the way they meant it. I do have opinions. I argued with Marcus Webb about land rights because he was wrong, and being wrong about land rights in the current territorial climate has consequences for people who cannot afford to be on the losing side of a legal dispute. I threw a boot at Thomas Hale because he walked into my father's store 2 weeks after my father's funeral and told me I should sell it, and he said it with the particular confidence of a man who has never had to work for anything he owns and assumes that a woman in grief is easy to maneuver. The boot was warranted. I would like to say I have mellowed, but I think that would be dishonest, and you said you preferred honesty. What I am is tired of being measured against a standard that was never designed to include me. My father built that store from nothing, and I have run it alongside him since I was 16, and I intend to keep running it, and I intend to do it well. If that is too much for a man to accept, then I suppose I am too much for that man. You mentioned that you are stubborn and direct and unlikely to do things the way they are supposed to be done. I find that less alarming than you might expect. Tell me about the ranch. Tell me about Cooper. And tell me what you mean when you say it is in better shape than it looks from the road, because that sentence has the sound of a man who is hoping no one looks too closely at something. Nathan read the last line and grinned so wide his jaw ached. He wrote back that same night. He told her about the ranch in detail, honest detail, because she had asked for it, and because she had already seen through the evasion in his first letter, and it seemed futile to try anything else. He told her it had been his father's ranch before it was his, that his father had died of a fever 4 years ago, and his mother had gone to live with her sister in Santa Fe shortly after, that he had been running it alone with one hired hand named Roscoe, who was 63 years old and deeply philosophical about the nature of cattle. He told her the south pasture needed work, that the barn roof had a slow leak he had been meaning to address for 2 seasons, that the cattle operation was profitable but not extravagantly so, and that the house had 4 rooms and a porch that faced west, which he considered the best feature of the entire property, because the sunsets over the Cimarron Range were genuinely extraordinary. He told her about Cooper, who was a buckskin quarter horse of 12 years and considerable personality, who had learned to open the gate latch with his nose and routinely let himself into the vegetable patch behind the house, and who had opinions about which trails were acceptable, and would communicate those opinions through a system of foot stomping and pointed staring that Nathan had learned to take seriously. He told her that he had not meant to be evasive about the ranch, but that he had learned early that people formed opinions about a man based on the condition of his property, and he was not particularly interested in being judged before he was known. He said he thought maybe they had that in common. Her reply came 2 weeks later and was longer than the first. Then his reply was longer than his second. By June they had exchanged 6 letters each, and by July they had fallen into a rhythm that felt, to Nathan, less like correspondence and more like conversation, the kind you picked back up in the middle without preamble, the kind where you didn't have to explain yourself before making a point. She told him about the store, about the particular challenge of running a business as a woman in a town that had not entirely made up its mind whether it approved, about the Merchants Association and the president of it, a man named Gerald Prout, who had twice suggested that she might want to think about taking on a male business partner to give the establishment more credibility, and who received the same answer both times. Delivered calmly, but with the clarity of a woman who had done the math and found no variable that added up to Gerald Prout being right. She told him about her father, Patrick Doyle, who had come from County Clare in Ireland at the age of 22, with nothing but a strong back and an absolute inability to accept being told what he could not do, and who had turned that into a feed and grain store that served half the county and never cheated a man in his life. She told him she missed him with a ferocity that still sometimes caught her off guard, that she would be doing inventory on a Tuesday afternoon and suddenly be unable to see the numbers because the missing was too immediate. Nathan understood that grief. He had his own version of it, lived in the same house where his father had died, worked the same land his father had worked, and knew the particular silence of a place that remembered the person who was gone. He wrote that to her, not elegantly but honestly. She wrote back, "That is exactly what it is, a place that remembers. You said it better than I could have." He didn't think that was true, because she said everything better than almost anyone he had ever encountered, but he appreciated the generosity of the statement. In August she asked, with the directness he had come to recognize as entirely characteristic of her, whether he intended to ever suggest meeting in person, or whether he planned to conduct this entire acquaintance through paper and ink. He had been thinking about it for weeks. He had been thinking about it with the particular anxiety of a man who was genuinely afraid, for the first time in a long time, of something mattering too much. He wrote back within 3 days. He wrote, "I have been considering that exact question. The honest answer is that I want to meet you very much, and I am also aware that a thing can be different in person than it is on paper, and not always in a good direction. I don't believe that will be the case with you, but I have been wrong before about things I believed. What I am proposing, if you are willing, is this. I can come to Abilene in September. I will not come with the expectation of anything other than meeting a person I have been corresponding with and finding out whether she is as remarkable in the flesh as she is on paper. I suspect she is. I will stay at the hotel and I will not impose on your time beyond what you offer willingly. If you tell me after the first hour that you find me disappointing, I will accept that and go home and probably think about it for the rest of my life, but I will accept it." The reply came back in 10 days, which was faster than usual. She wrote, "Come in September. I find people disappointing with some regularity, so I will not make you any promises, but I will say that I have not yet found you disappointing on paper, and that is more than I can say for most. I will be at the store on the 15th. Come and find me there." Nathan Finley rode the train from Raton to Abilene in September of 1882 with a clean shirt, a good hat, and the slightly terrified feeling of a man about to jump from a considerable height into water of unknown depth. Abilene in 1882 was still a working town, though the wild days of the cattle drives that had made it famous were winding down as the railroads pushed further west and the cattle trade shifted its routes. Texas Street still had its saloons and its commerce, but the town had been making its peace with permanence for several years, settling into the shape of a place that intended to stay. Nathan had been there once before, 7 years ago, and it looked more settled now, more sure of itself. He found Elm Street without difficulty. He found the store with its painted sign, Doyle's Feed and Grain, in letters that were slightly uneven but made up for it in confidence. He stood outside it for approximately 30 seconds, which was enough time for him to notice that his hands were not entirely steady, and then he pushed open the door. The bell above it rang. The woman behind the counter looked up from the ledger she was writing in, and Nathan had a single second of confused impression. Dark red hair pinned up with a few strands escaping at the temples, sharp green eyes, a jaw that suggested the same stubborn architecture as every word she had ever written to him. And then she looked at him with an expression that was evaluating and direct and entirely unsurprised, and she said, "You must be Nathan Finley." "I must be," he said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. She set down her pen. She came around from behind the counter, which put them about 6 feet apart, and she looked at him the way he imagined she looked at ledger numbers that didn't quite add up, searching for the line where the discrepancy was. He looked back at her with the same attention, because he was not a man who looked away from things. She was tall for a woman of that era, nearly 5 feet and 7 inches, which meant she met his gaze at about the level of his chin. She was wearing a practical dark blue dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she had the particular quality of a person who did not spend much time wondering how they appeared to others, because they had more important things to think about. "You're younger than I expected," she said finally. "I'm 30, he said. "You're 24. We're roughly contemporary." "I know how old we both are," she said, and there was the faintest suggestion of amusement at the corner of her mouth. "I meant you look like someone who hasn't decided yet whether he's going to be surprised by things. Most men your age have already made up their minds." He thought about that for a moment. "I've been surprised enough times to know it's usually worth staying open to it." She studied him for another moment, and then she said, "There's coffee in the back. Come and have some if you want. I have 3 more columns to balance before noon, and you can talk to me while I do it." That was how Nathan Finley spent his first hour in the company of Delia Doyle, sitting on a stool in the back room of her father's feed store while she balanced accounts and asked him questions about the Cimarron River watershed and the grazing rights situation in Colfax County, which was a subject of genuine complexity and current dispute. And he answered her honestly and in some detail, because she asked with the precision of someone who actually wanted to know the answer and not just the shape of the answer. She knew more about the territorial land disputes than he had expected. She explained, without being asked, that her father had subscribed to 3 newspapers and made her read all of them from the time she was 12, and that understanding how land and commerce worked was not optional if you intended to operate a business in a place where both were constantly in flux. He told her about the Maxwell land grant troubles, The way the ring of political interests had manipulated land titles across northern New Mexico for years. The way small ranchers like himself operated in a state of permanent legal uncertainty that required you to know exactly who owned what and why and be ready to defend it. She listened without interrupting, which he recognized as a particular kind of intelligence, the ability to not fill space when information was coming. When he finished, she said, "The territorial government's handling of the land grant situation has been unconscionable. Those disputes have displaced families, real families with real claims." She said it with a directness that acknowledged the injustice plainly, without ceremony, the way a person stated a fact they considered self-evident. "It has," he said, "and the men with political connections have generally come out ahead of the men without them. That's not news to anyone who has been paying attention." "No," she said, "it isn't." She made a final notation in the ledger and closed it. "All right, I'm done with the columns. Are you hungry?" He was. She took him to a small restaurant 2 streets over where she apparently ate lunch regularly and was greeted by the woman who ran it with the comfortable familiarity of a regular customer. They sat across from each other at a table by the window, and they ate roast chicken and cornbread, and Delia Doyle told him about Gerald Pruitt's most recent attempt to suggest that she take on a partner, which had occurred just the previous week. "What did you say to him?" Nathan asked. "I said that the store's accounts were in better order than any 3 businesses on this street combined, and that if credibility were determined by the quality of the books rather than the gender of the person keeping them, I should be the president of the Merchants Association." She picked up her coffee cup. He did not enjoy that. I imagine he didn't. He said I was difficult. "You are difficult," Nathan said. "You are also correct, which is the more important variable." She looked at him across the table with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between surprise and assessment, and then she said, "Clement told you I was too much. Why did that make you want to write to me instead of staying well away?" He had been thinking about how he would answer this if she asked, and he had decided somewhere between Raton and Abilene that the only answer worth giving was the true one. "Because I have spent my whole life being told I am too much of various things," he said. "Too stubborn, too direct, not sociable enough, not interested enough in doing things the way they've always been done. And every time someone said that to me, I noticed that what they really meant was that I wasn't enough like what they wanted me to be. And I thought that a woman who had 4 men describe her as too much was probably the most interesting person in that town, because she clearly was not interested in making herself smaller so other people would be more comfortable. I find that admirable. And also, if I am honest, I find the idea of a person who argues about land rights for 45 minutes significantly more interesting than a person who does not." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Abilene moved along Texas Street with its usual commerce, horses and wagons, and people going about the business of a Tuesday in September. Then she said quietly, not with performance but with the simple sound of someone saying a thing they had not said before, "Nobody has ever said that to me. The admirable part." "Then they weren't paying attention," Nathan said. She looked at him for a long moment and then she looked out the window, and he could see in the set of her jaw that she was deciding something, though he couldn't tell what. He waited, because he had learned from her letters that she moved at her own pace and rushing her would be both useless and rude. "Come and look at the store properly," she said finally. "I'll show you what I've done with it since my father died." That afternoon was one Nathan would later mark as the afternoon he understood that he was entirely done for, completely, and without any available reversal. She walked him through the store with the confidence of someone who had built something and knew exactly what they had built, showing him the reorganization of the inventory system she had designed, the account structure she had developed, the supplier relationships she had renegotiated after her father's death to get better terms. She talked about the business with the same fluency other people talked about things they loved, which was, Nathan realized, because it was a thing she loved, not just a thing she did. She loved it because her father had loved it, and because she had made it her own on top of that, and because it was the fullest expression she had of who she was and what she was capable of. He asked good questions because he was genuinely interested, and she answered them fully because she could tell the difference between genuine interest and polite performance. By the end of the afternoon, they were in the back room again, sitting across from each other with cups of water because the coffee was long gone, and the conversation had moved from the store to ranching to the difference between different strains of grass seed and their drought tolerance, which was a subject Nathan knew reasonably well, and which Delia had strong opinions about based on her experience selling seed to farmers across the county. "The buffalo grass holds in a dry year," she said. "The bluestem goes faster, I've seen it." "You're right," he said. "I switched the southern pasture to buffalo grass 2 years ago for exactly that reason." "And," she asked. "It held," he said. "The summer of '81 was dry enough to worry about, and it held." She nodded with the satisfied air of a person whose theory has been confirmed by data, which he found completely charming. When the light through the front window turned gold and long, she looked at the angle of it and said, "You should get settled at the hotel. Are you staying through the week?" He had booked 5 days because he had not known what the right amount of time was, and 5 had seemed like enough to be realistic and not so much as to be presumptuous. He told her so. "Good," she said. "Come back tomorrow morning. I have to make a delivery run to 3 farms outside of town, and you could come along if you want to see the county." "I want to see the county," he said. She walked him to the door and held it open, and they stood in the threshold for a moment in the late September light. "Nathan Finley," she said, trying his name out like she was checking whether it fit. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She considered. "I expected you to be disappointing," she said. "Most people are." "And?" She looked at him directly, green eyes steady, and she said, "You are not disappointing. That is not a small thing coming from me." "I know," he said. And he left before he said anything that ruined it. The delivery run the next day was done in Delia's wagon, a solid bay draft horse named Margaret pulling them along the road out of town in the early morning light, and Delia drove with the ease of someone who had been handling reins since childhood, which she had. She told him about her customers, the farm families who depended on the store, the particular situations of each: a widow trying to manage a homestead on her own with 3 young children, a family of German immigrants who had arrived 5 years ago and built something remarkable from almost nothing, an old man named Caleb Morrison who was 81 years old and refused any suggestion that he might want to consider retiring, which Delia clearly found entirely admirable. Nathan listened and asked questions and watched her face as she talked, which was more animated than it had been inside the store, as if being outside expanded something in her. At the 3rd farm they stopped. She climbed down from the wagon with a bag of grain and walked toward the farmhouse and was met by the farmer's wife, a woman named Ellen Davies, who embraced her with the warmth of a genuine friendship. And Nathan sat on the wagon seat and watched Delia Doyle stand in the Kansas morning light, talking to her friend with her red hair bright in the sun, and her hands moving with the expressiveness that all her words had. And the feeling in his chest was so large and specific that it was almost uncomfortable. He was thoroughly in love with her. He had been halfway there through 8 weeks of letters, and now he was entirely there, with no reasonable path back, and the prospect was not frightening in the way he had expected. It was instead clarifying, like the moment after a cloudy day when the sky opened, and you could see all the way to the edge of the earth. Ellen Davies noticed him sitting on the wagon and raised her eyebrows at Delia with an expression that women used when they were communicating something without words. Delia said something he couldn't hear, and Ellen laughed, and Delia shook her head and walked back to the wagon with the bag empty, and a look on her face that suggested she was deciding, again, about something. "She asked who you were," Delia said, climbing back up. "What did you say?" "I said you were a man I was corresponding with who had come to see if I was worth the trouble in person." He considered this. And what did she say? She said, based on the fact that you were still sitting on the wagon instead of trying to manage my horses for me, you were probably going to be all right. He laughed, and she flicked the reins and Margaret started back down the road, and they were quiet for a while in the easy way that people were quiet together, when words were not required to fill the space. The 5 days moved faster than Nathan wanted them to. They spent parts of each day together, sometimes at the store, sometimes walking, once at a lecture at the local Methodist church that Delia had insisted on attending, because the speaker was a woman who had written a widely circulated paper on the economics of small rural businesses, and Delia wanted to hear her speak in person. Nathan sat beside her and watched her take mental notes with the intensity of someone encountering a genuinely useful idea, and afterward she talked about the lecture, the entire walk back to the store with the fired-up energy of a person whose mind had been engaged at full capacity, which was, Nathan thought, the best possible version of a person. On the 4th evening they sat on the bench outside the store after closing time, in the cooling September dark, and talked until the street emptied around them, and the only light was from the saloon 2 blocks over and the stars overhead, which were magnificent, because Abilene sat on the flat Kansas plain with nothing to interrupt the sky. She had told him something that evening, carefully and watching his face as she said it, about the year after her father died, how dark it had been, how she had run the store on pure stubbornness for the first 3 months because she could not feel anything beyond the mechanical necessity of keeping it going, and how the correspondence with him had been. She said it directly and without making it larger than she meant, something to look forward to in a period when looking forward had been difficult. He said, "I know what you mean. My days are better for having a letter to think about writing," she said. "It is strange to feel known by someone you have never met." He said, "Is it strange now that you have met me?" She looked at him in the dark for a long moment. Then she said, "No, that is what is strange. It isn't strange at all. You are exactly who you were on paper, which I did not entirely believe was possible." He said, "So are you." She looked away, out at the dark street, and he could see the line of her jaw and the particular quality of her expression, which was not guarded exactly but was careful in the way of someone who had been told too many times that the things they were problems, and who had protected themselves accordingly. He said, "Delia." She looked back at him. He said, "I am going to ask you something, and you can tell me I'm moving too fast, and I will accept that entirely." She waited. He said, "I would like to come back. Not just this once. I would like to keep seeing you in person as often as we can manage it, and I would like to see where that goes. Not because I need it to go anywhere specific, but because I think you are the most interesting person I have ever met, and I am not interested in conducting that through paper indefinitely." She was quiet for long enough that he prepared himself for the possibility that the answer was no, or not yet, or something else that was not an opening. Then she said, "You should know that the store is not negotiable. I am not going to be managed or redirected away from it. Whatever this is, it has to work around the reality that this is my life and I am not going to give it up." "I know that," he said. "I have never thought anything different. I'm not asking you to give anything up." "Men say that," she said, not with bitterness but with the plain honesty of someone who had watched it happen, and then they find out what they actually meant was that they were willing to tolerate the store as long as it didn't become inconvenient. He thought about how to answer that honestly. He said, "I cannot promise you I will be perfect. I will probably say something wrong at some point or miss the right thing when I should have seen it. But I can tell you that in all the letters we have exchanged, the thing I have never once wanted to do is make you smaller. You are remarkable exactly as you are. I don't want a version of you that has been edited for my comfort." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, "All right, Nathan Finley, come back." He came back in November. He came back in January, making the trip in winter cold that bit through 2 layers of coat and made the train feel like a mercy. He came back in March. and in April, and by May of 1883 they had seen each other 8 times, and the letters between visits had evolved into something that was no longer exactly correspondence, and more exactly the ongoing conversation of two people who were building a shared interior life with each other, who referred to previous letters without explaining the reference, who argued about things across 300 miles of prairie and resolved them imperfectly, and then came back to the argument in the next letter with additional evidence. They argued, really argued, about things that mattered. She thought he was too willing to accept the legal ambiguity around his land title, and should be more aggressive in getting it formally clarified, which was a subject of some heat, because Nathan had reasons for his approach that he had not fully articulated, and Delia had no patience for incomplete explanations. He told her eventually, on a cold January visit, that the cost of the legal process was not trivial and he was managing cash flow carefully, and she listened to the full version of his situation and then said, with typical directness, "You should have said that 3 letters ago instead of letting me think you were being passive about it." He said, "I didn't want to make the financial situation sound worse than it is." She said, "Nathan, I balance accounts for a living. I'm not going to think less of a man for managing carefully. I'm going to think less of a man for not trusting me with the real information." He thought about that and said, "You're right, I'm sorry." She looked at him with the expression she had when she was recalibrating something. He said, "I spent a long time not having anyone to explain myself to. I'm not always sure what to offer," she said. "Everything, that is what I want. The whole actual situation, not the version that sounds better." "That goes both ways," he said. She said, "I know that." And then after a moment, "I'm not always easy to be honest with. I know that too. Sometimes I react before I think." "Sometimes," he said, with a slight inflection that made her eyes narrow and then briefly warm. In May of 1883, he came back to Abilene with something different in mind, and he spent the first 2 days of the visit simply being with her, helping at the store in the morning and eating lunch with her and walking the town in the evenings. And on the 3rd evening they were sitting on the bench outside the store again, which had become their particular place, and the May air was warm, and the sky was fading through pink to dark above the Kansas plain. He said, "I have been thinking about something for a long time." She said, "You think about things for too long before you say them. I have noticed that." He said, "I know, I'm working on it." He looked at the fading sky. "I would like to ask you to marry me. But I am aware that a proposal requires you to think about certain practical realities, and I want to address those before I ask, because I don't want you to have to choose between what you want and what you need, and I think those 2 things deserve to both be answered." She was very still beside him. He said, "I know the store is not negotiable. I have been thinking about how to structure this so that it doesn't have to be. There are 2 ways I can see this working. One is that you keep the store and I keep the ranch, and we conduct this as a long-distance arrangement, which I don't want because I want to be in the same place as you. The other is that we find a way to make both things work together. I don't know yet exactly what that looks like. I think it might mean finding someone reliable to run the store with you, someone who can manage it when you need to be in New Mexico, and I would come to Abilene regularly for the periods when you need to be here. It would take work to figure out, but I don't want to ask you to give up your father's store. I don't want to ask you to give up anything you've built." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the sky went fully dark and the first stars appeared. Then she said, "You've been thinking about this for months." "Since January," he said. "You worked out a practical framework for not asking me to give up my independence before asking me if I wanted to marry you." "Yes," he said. She turned and looked at him in the dark, and her expression was something he had not seen on her face before, something more open than she usually allowed herself, more moved than her ordinary precision. She said, "Nathan, ask me." He turned to face her on the bench. He did not have a ring, which was something he had thought about and decided was less important than the question itself, but he would remedy that soon. He said, Delia Doyle, I am asking you to marry me. Not a simplified version of you, not a version that has given up anything she built. You as you are, arguments and ledgers and boots thrown when warranted and all of it. I love all of it. I love you. The word love, the first time either of them had said it directly in that particular configuration, landed between them with the weight of a thing that had been true for a long time, waiting for the right moment to be spoken. She said, I love you too. She said it quickly, like she had been waiting for permission. I have been trying to work out how to say it for 2 months and I couldn't find the right construction. He laughed, surprised by the admission. You at a loss for the right construction. When it matters this much, yes, she said. She reached over and put her hand over his, which was sitting on his knee, and her hand was warm and certain. Yes, I will marry you, Nathan Finley. They were married in Abilene in August of 1883, at the small Presbyterian church 2 streets from the store, with Clement Finley as Nathan's witness and Ellen Davies as Delia's. The ceremony was modest in the way that both of them preferred, without excessive performance, but the moment the minister said the words and Nathan took Delia's hand and looked at her in the August light coming through the church windows, something settled in him that he had not known was unsettled, a sense of rightness so complete it was almost physical. Delia had arranged, before the wedding, exactly what Nathan had suggested in his proposal. She had hired a young woman named Clara Pratt, 22 years old and the daughter of a local school teacher, to manage the store's daily operations. Clara was sharp and reliable and had worked in the store part-time for 2 years and knew the accounts nearly as well as Delia did. The arrangement was that Delia would spend roughly 4 months of the year in Abilene, managing the store directly and handling the supplier relationships and the major account decisions, and the other months would be spent at the ranch in Cimarron, where she would manage the ranch's financial operation, which had previously been done by Nathan with varying success and no organized system. They went to the ranch in September of 1883, arriving in Cimarron on a clear afternoon when the mountains to the west were the exact shade of blue that Nathan had tried to describe in a letter once without quite capturing it. She stood on the porch looking west and was quiet for a long moment. He stood beside her and waited. She said, "You were right about the sunsets." "I usually am about the things I'm certain about," he said. She looked at him sideways. "That is an absolutely insufferable thing to say." "Yes," he agreed. She smiled, which was still one of the most valuable things in his world when she did it, because she didn't do it for performance, only when something genuinely warranted it. They went inside and she walked through the house with the same attention she gave everything, looking at things without commentary, and when she got to the main room she stood in the middle of it and turned around once, taking in the bare walls and the sparse furniture and the general appearance of a space that had been lived in by a man who had not thought much about how it looked. She said, "I have some ideas about this room." "I suspected you might," he said. "They don't require your approval," she said. "But I am telling you in advance because I believe in transparency." "What are the ideas?" she told him, and they were practical and sensible, and involved reorganizing the furniture to use the light better and adding a proper work table near the window for the account books, and he agreed to all of it and helped her move the furniture that same afternoon. The first year of their marriage was one of the most genuinely interesting years of Nathan's life, and he was aware of that clearly enough that he tried not to take it for granted. It was not without friction, because two people of strong character and established habits living in close proximity to each other for the first time invariably produced friction, but the friction was never the kind that corroded. It was the kind that refined. She reorganized his account-keeping system within the first month and found 3 billing irregularities with a supplier that he had missed, which resulted in a recovering of funds that he applied to finally fixing the barn roof, which she had identified as a priority approximately 12 minutes after her first look at it. He learned to tell her things directly instead of managing the timing of information, because She invariably noticed when he was doing that, and it was not worth the secondary conversation about transparency that followed. She learned, more slowly, to ask when she was uncertain about something rather than proceeding on an assumption. Because the ranch had systems and geographic realities, she was still learning. And the one time she made a significant decision about the cattle schedule without checking with him, first it cost them a week's worth of correction. She came to him afterward, which he knew from the set of her jaw cost her something, and said, "I was wrong about the timing on the south pasture rotation. I should have asked." He said, "You'll know that particular problem now." She said, "I should have asked anyway." He said, "Yes, but you were also working from reasoning that would have been correct in different terrain. The Flint Hills topography you know from Kansas doesn't apply the same way here." She looked at him with the expression of someone revising a conclusion. "Is that actually true, or are you trying to make me feel better?" "Both things can be true simultaneously," he said. She thought about it and conceded the point. By the spring of 1884, the ranch's finances were in better shape than they had been in 4 years, because Delia had approached the books with the same systematic intelligence she had applied to the feed store, and the combined effect of her reorganization and Nathan's competent management of the actual cattle operation was more productive than either alone. They were happy. It was not the happiness of people who had found something easy, but the happiness of people who had found something worth working for, and were working for it with the full capacity of two capable people who respected each other. In the fall of 1884, she told him one evening, quietly, that she was going to have a child. She said it with the same directness she said everything, but her hands, he noticed, were folded in her lap with a tightness that indicated the directness was covering something else. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I think so. I'm not sure what I feel about it yet. I need to think." He said, "That's fine." She said, "I know that some things will change. I am not sure which things yet." He said, "We will figure out which things when we know more." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me not to worry," he said. "You're not a person who worries without cause. If you're thinking about something, it's worth thinking about." She let out a long breath and some of the tightness in her hands eased. "The store," she said. "I need to make sure Clara can handle the annual supplier negotiations, not just the daily operations. That's a different skill set and we haven't developed it yet." "Then you go to Abilene in January and develop it," he said. "We have 4 months." She nodded, doing the calculation already. He said, "Delia." She looked up. He said, "I think you are going to be extraordinary at this too." "For what it's worth." She looked at him for a moment with that open expression. She allowed herself now more readily than she had in the beginning, and she said, "I hope so." And then, quietly, "I am glad you are the person I am doing this with." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his. The baby arrived in the summer of 1885, a boy they named Patrick after her father, which was Nathan's suggestion, made because he understood what that name would mean to her, and which made her cry in a way she rarely allowed herself, brief and fierce and real. Patrick Finley came into the world with dark red hair and Nathan's stubborn mouth, and an immediate opinion about everything, expressed in the only vocabulary available to him, which was volume. He was exactly as much as both of his parents combined, which meant he was, from the beginning, a great deal. Delia nursed him with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and was back doing account books within 6 days of his arrival, which Nathan did not argue with because he understood by then that keeping her mind engaged was not a luxury, but a structural necessity of her well-being. Roscoe, the 63-year-old hired hand who had been with the ranch for 11 years, held the baby once and declared that he had his mother's look of absolute judgment and would grow up to tell people exactly what was wrong with their assumptions, which Nathan considered entirely accurate. Clara managed the store's supplier negotiations with Delia's guidance from Cimarron, by correspondence, and managed them adequately enough that Delia only had to go to Abilene for 2 weeks instead of the full month, which was a considerable success for their arrangement. The life they built after that expanded steadily, carefully, in the way that things built by two competent people with good judgment tended to expand. Nathan hired a second hand to help with the growing cattle operation, a young man of 22 named Henry Reyes, who had grown up on a ranch in the Rio Grande Valley and knew cattle well, and who discovered within 3 weeks of arrival that Mrs. Finley would answer any question he asked directly and expected him to do the same, which he found initially startling and eventually came to appreciate deeply. The store in Abilene continued to grow under Clara's management, with Delia's oversight and seasonal presence. Gerald Prout of the Merchants Association had retired in 1884, and his successor was a woman named Frances Holloway who had no particular issue with Delia's management style, and significantly better conversations with her about the direction of commerce in the county. In 1887, their second child was born, a daughter they named Rose, who came out looking like Nathan and thinking like Delia, which was a combination that Nathan privately considered somewhat daunting and publicly considered wonderful. Patrick, by then 2, received his baby sister with the concentrated interest of a small person who has been an only child and is revising his understanding of the world. Delia taught them both to read early, because she had opinions about the importance of literacy that she had expressed to Nathan even before Patrick was born, and which he agreed with completely. She read to them every evening from whatever she was reading herself, adjusting the text to be comprehensible but not condescending, because she did not believe in condescension as an educational philosophy. Nathan told them stories at night, drawn from the real history of the land they lived on, the long and complicated history of the Cimarron country, the Jicarilla Apache people who had lived in these mountains long before any settler arrived, the Mexican land grant history, the way the territory was still being shaped and disputed and settled, and sometimes unsettled again. He told the stories without simplification because he believed, as Delia did, that the world was complicated and children who were going to live in it deserved the complicated version. There were hard years. The drought of 1886 hit the New Mexico territory with particular severity, and Nathan spent 6 months managing limited water and reducing the herd to sustainable numbers, making decisions that required precision and willingness to accept short-term loss for long-term viability. Delia worked the accounts through that period with the same steadiness she brought to everything difficult, identifying where they could reduce costs without compromising the operation's future capacity, and what she found kept them from the edge they had come close to. On a particularly bad night in July of that year, when the south pasture was cracked and the creek was half its normal depth, and 2 of their best cattle had sickened, Nathan sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and was very quiet for a long time. Delia sat across from him with the account spread in front of her and watched him. He said, "My father nearly lost this ranch twice. Once to weather and once to the land dispute. He held it both times, and I always thought I understood how hard that was. I don't think I understood," she said. "You're not going to lose it," he said. "You don't know that," she said. "I've looked at every number and I know what the range is. The worst case is bad, but it is not fatal if we manage it the way I've outlined. The land is good land, Nathan. It will come back." He looked at her across the table, this woman who had become the most constant and essential fact of his daily existence, who argued with him and challenged him and kept perfect accounts and read to his children and threw a boot when warranted and loved him with the same thorough attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. He said, "I don't know what I would do without you to tell me the actual state of things." She said, "You would manage, but you don't have to, so let's not find out." She slid a page across the table. "Look at this column. Tell me if I've missed anything." He looked at it and didn't miss anything, and they worked through the numbers together until the lamp burned low and the night outside was quiet except for the coyotes, and by the end of it the picture was not easy, but it was navigable, and navigable was enough. The drought broke in the fall. The land came back slowly, the way it always did, with the first rains bringing green back to the brown pastures, with the particular drama of the desert returning to life. Nathan stood at the fence line watching the south pasture green up in October, and Delia stood beside him with Patrick on her hip, the boy pointing at a hawk circling overhead with the intense focus of a 3-year-old with opinions about birds. Nathan said, "Look at that," she said. "I told you the land was good." He said, "You did." He looked at her. "You tell me a lot of things that turn out to be true." She said, "You know that is not as complimentary as you think it is, since you could just be acknowledging that I have consistently good judgment." He said, "That is exactly what I'm acknowledging." She looked at him sideways and he looked at her, and they both started laughing at the same moment for reasons that Patrick found confusing, and Rose, asleep against Delia's shoulder, was entirely unaffected by. Clement visited in the summer of 1888. He arrived from Abilene, where he was still working as a telegraph operator, now married to a calm and observant woman named Julia, who had apparently decided that Clement's chaos was something she could work with. And he came with Julia and their infant son on the train to Raton, and Nathan drove out to meet them. Clement had not seen the ranch in 4 years and stood in the yard looking around with an expression Nathan recognized as his brother revising an internal estimate. He said, "This is considerably better than I expected." Nathan said, "You had low expectations." Clement said, "I always have low expectations for endeavors that depend on soil and weather. It's a survival strategy." He looked at the house, the neatened yard, the repaired barn with its new roof, the organized outbuildings. "What happened?" Delia, who had come out onto the porch, said. "I happened. Hello, Clement." Clement looked at her and said, with the expression of a man revising multiple estimates simultaneously, "You made all of this better," she said. "Nathan made it better. I organized the books and found the roof leak and suggested we move the storage shed. Nathan does the actual work of running a cattle ranch." "That is an extremely fair division of credit," Nathan said. Clement looked between them with an expression that was somewhere between admiration and relief, the specific relief of a brother who has watched someone make a decision he wasn't sure was wise and found out it was correct. He said, "I wrote that letter to Nathan about you as a warning." Delia said, "I know. He told me." Clement said, "I was very wrong about what I was warning him about." She said, "You were warning him that I was too much. You were right about the fact. You were wrong about whether that was a problem." Clement looked at his brother and said, "How did you know?" "From one paragraph in a letter," Nathan said, "because anyone who had been described by 4 different men as too much was clearly someone those men were too small for, not someone who was too large. It seemed worth finding out if I was in a different category." Delia said, "And?" He looked at her, standing on their porch in the afternoon sun, and said, "Different category." She shook her head at him in the particular way that meant she found him simultaneously exasperating and worth it, which was, he had determined, the best possible thing to be. Clement and Julia stayed for 10 days, and it was a good 10 days, full of the noise and warm confusion of children and meals and long evening conversations on the porch where Nathan and Clement talked about their parents and the old ranch and the particular way memory worked when a person came back to a place that held a lot of it. Delia and Julia found, with the efficiency of 2 intelligent women in the same house, that they genuinely liked each other, which Nathan observed with satisfaction. On the last evening, sitting on the porch after the children were in bed and Julia had gone to check on the baby, Clement said to Nathan, with the slight excess of sincerity that meant he was saying something he had been thinking about for a while, "You're happy." Nathan said, "I am." Clement said, "I didn't know if you knew how to do that." Nathan said, "Neither did I." Clement said, "She's extraordinary." Nathan said, "She is. I knew it from the letter." Clement said, "I wrote that letter as a warning." Nathan said, "You wrote it as a warning, and I read it as a recommendation. That is not the first time you and I have read the same information differently." Clement laughed and looked out at the dark hills and said, "I'm glad you came to Abilene." Nathan said, "So am I. The years after that moved in the particular rhythm of a life that had found its shape and was living fully in it. The ranch grew steadily, not extravagantly, but in the solid and compounding way that good management produced over time. Nathan took on an additional section of land adjacent to the south pasture in 1889 when the neighboring rancher sold, and the expansion added capacity that they had been planning for. The store in Abilene continued to operate under Clara's management, with Delia's involvement evolving over the years into something closer to a senior partnership than direct management. As Clara's skills developed, and Delia's primary investment of time shifted to the ranch and to her children, though she maintained her direct involvement in the major decisions and visited Abilene for the supplier negotiations every year. She never stopped being Delia Doyle, in addition to being Delia Finley. That had always been Nathan's understanding of the arrangement, and it turned out to be correct, which was one of the facts of their marriage that he considered most clearly right. Patrick grew up with his mother's hair and his father's quiet watchfulness, a boy who collected facts the way some children collected stones, and who was, by the age of 7, asking questions about the cattle operation with enough specificity that Nathan gave him genuine answers instead of simplified ones. He was going to be good at this land, Nathan thought. He had the right combination of stubbornness and patience. Rose grew up with her father's dark eyes and her mother's absolute refusal to accept an inadequate explanation, and at the age of 5, told Henry Rays that his method of tying a particular knot was inefficient and demonstrated a better one, which Henry confirmed was in fact more efficient, and which he thereafter used. Delia watched her children with the particular quality of attention she gave things she loved, which was total and precise, and Nathan watched Delia watch them and felt the fullness of his life as a physical thing, something with weight and warmth. In 1891, Roscoe retired. He was 71 years old and had been working the land since before Nathan's father had bought it, and he retired to a small house in Cimarron Town where his daughter lived, and his departure left a gap in the daily fabric of the ranch that Nathan felt more than he had expected. Roscoe was replaced by a capable young man, but it was not the same, and Nathan understood that it was not supposed to be, that some things in a life were unrepeatable, and the right response was to have known their value while they were present. He told Delia about this one evening, lying in the dark after the children were asleep, in the quiet room of the house that now had things on the walls and warm rugs on the floor and the accumulated personality of two people who had made a home in it together. She said, "Roscoe was part of your father's ranch. Losing him is another piece of losing your father." He said, "Yes, I think that's right." She said, "That doesn't go away, but it does settle." He said, "Is that what happened with your father?" She said, "Mostly. There are still days when I want to tell him something and the missing is immediate. But yes, mostly it has settled into something I can carry without it stopping me." He reached over in the dark and found her hand, and she took it. She said, "Patrick asked me yesterday who Grandpa Patrick was named after." He said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him about my father, all of it. The crossing from Ireland, the store, the newspapers, the opinion about buffalo grass seed, all of it." He said, "What did Patrick think?" She said, "He said he sounded like a person who knew what he wanted and went and got it." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is an extremely accurate description." She said, "He is his mother's child." Nathan said, "He is, thank God." She made a sound that was either a laugh or an exhalation of affection, and turned toward him in the dark, and that was enough. That was everything. The warmth and the quiet and the particular weight of shared years, and the absolute knowledge of who the person beside you was. In the spring of 1892, they drove into Cimarron together for the town's annual spring market. The children on the wagon seat between them and the Cimarron range to the west, showing its late snow on the high peaks. And Delia bought seed, and Nathan talked cattle prices with 3 other ranchers, and Patrick very seriously negotiated the purchase of a pocket knife with his saved coins, and Rose found a ribbon the exact color of the Indian paintbrush that grew on the south slope of their property. On the way back, the children drowsy in the wagon bed, the late afternoon light going golden over everything, Delia said, without particular preamble, the way she said things when they had been sitting in her thoughts long enough, "Do you remember your first letter? You said finally someone worth the ride." He said, "I remember," she said. "Were you right?" He drove in silence for a moment, looking at the road and the mountains, and the way the light was catching the new green of the spring grass on the hills. He said, "I was considerably more right than I knew how to be at the time," she said. "That is also an absolutely insufferable thing to say." He said, "I know," she said. "I love you." He said, "I love you," and then, "Was I right about the other direction too?" She was quiet for a moment, and the wagon moved along the road, and Patrick murmured something in his sleep, and Rose had fallen entirely asleep with the ribbon still clutched in her hand. Delia said, "When I got your first letter, I almost didn't answer it. I had a policy." He said, "I know," she said, "but something about the way you read what Clement wrote. You didn't read it as a warning. You read it as a recommendation. I thought, whoever this person is, he reads things differently than other people." He said, "And," she said, "and I have not been disappointed. That is still not a small thing." He laughed, and she laughed, and the wagon moved home through the spring evening of New Mexico in 1892, the mountains going purple, and the sky going deep blue, and the first stars appearing above the Cimarron Range, and the life they had built together moving forward around them in all its specific and unrepeatable fullness. Nathan Finley, who had spent 3 years too quiet in a house that remembered his father, who had read a warning in a letter and heard instead a clarion call, who had written to a woman he did not know because she sounded like the most honest version of a person he had ever encountered on paper, drove his family home through the evening in the territory he had decided to make his life in. And he was grateful, specifically and without reservation, for every mile of the ride that had brought him here. Delia Doyle Finley, who had been described in every letter as too much for any man, sat on the wagon seat beside the man who had read that and said finally, and knew, as she had known for nearly a decade now, that the right person did not want a smaller version of you. The right person saw the whole version and said yes to that, the opinions and the ledgers and the boot thrown when warranted, and the grief and the love and the particular fire that every diminishing man before him had called a problem. She reached over and put her hand over Nathan's where it held the reins. He turned his palm up and held her hand. The mountains went dark and the stars came out in their full number over the territory, and the road home was clear, and the children slept, and everything that had been uncertain was certain now, and everything that had needed to be built had been built, and they drove through the last light together toward the lamp in the window of the house that was theirs. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.